אוקיי, מעולה. תודה אריק, נראה לי שאנחנו מקליטים. סבבה.
כן, זה נראה שאני מקליט, כן.
יופי, תודה אריק.
בבקשה.
Okay, so for all the non-Hebrew-speaking people around here, this is the Israeli Data Platform Meetup. I will start with a short intro in Hebrew, sorry, and then we'll move on to Gianluca's session. אז שלום לכולם, ערב טוב, חג שמח, שנה טובה, סגר נעים, מה שאתם רוצים, שמח פה. נפגשנו פעם אחרונה לפני שבועיים, לי זה נראה כמו לפני 100 שנה, באמת זה נראה המון זמן, היה באמצע ראש השנה וסגר וכל הבלגן הזה. אנחנו בדרך כלל נפגשים פעם בשבוע בזמן האחרון, הפעם יצא פעם בשבועיים, חגים וכל זה. אז קצת הודעות, עדכונים וכאלה, אם יש לכם שאלות, דברים שלא קשורים כמובן להרצאה, שתבואו אחר כך ואתם רוצים לדבר בעברית, אז עכשיו זה הזמן, אחר כך נעבור להרצאה של ג'נלוקה שתהיה כמובן באנגלית. אז אני רוצה ככה לעבור על המצגת בזריזות. אם יש פעמים מישהו שעדיין לא מכיר ולא חבר, אנחנו עדת הפלטפורם מיטאפ, תיכנסו לאתר של מיטאפ, יש פה את הלינק, יש פה את ה-QR קוד, תצטרפו, תירשמו, תקבלו עדכונים על כל האירועים ומפגשים שאנחנו עושים. יש לנו קבוצה מאוד פעילה בפייסבוק, מוזמנים להצטרף גם לשם כמובן, דיונים מקצועיים, מחפשי עבודה, מחפשי עובדים, כל דבר שקשור לעולם עדת הפלטפורם קורה שם, מוזמנים להצטרף. במקביל אלינו יש גם את הקבוצה שהיא חלק מפס, הגלובל היברו וירטואל גרופ, שמוביל אותה רונן אריאלי, וגם שם יש בערך אחת לחודש זה יוצא, מפגשים כמובן וירטואליים, היום אין משהו שלא וירטואלי, הרצאות כאלה ואחרות, שם זה בהכרח כולם בעברית, אצלנו כמו שאתם רואים אנחנו קצת מגוונים, ולפעמים מביאים אורחים מחול, אבל כדאי מומלץ לעקוב גם אחרי הקבוצה הזאת, ויש לנו את הערוץ יוטיוב, שבעצם את כל ההקלטות אנחנו מעלים לשם, יש שם כבר ארכיון די עשיר ויפה של כל ההרצאות שהיו בזמן האחרון במיטאפ שלנו, הרבה מאוד דברים, וכמובן גם בהמשך, גם את ההקלטה של מה שיש היום, אנחנו נעלה את זה לשם, אז מומלץ גם לעשות סאבסקרייב, להירשם ולקבל עדכון בכל פעם שמעלים לשם משהו חדש. זהו, דבר אחרון, למי שלא מכיר רדיו SQL Server, איתן בלומין ואנוכי, מקשקשים, מבלבלים את המוח על SQL Server, פרויקטים, פיצ'רים, מראיינים אורחים באולפן לפעמים, כל מיני דברים שקשורים ל-SQL Server, פודקאסט שיוצא פעם בחודש, יש גרסה גם בעברית, גם באנגלית, משהו כמו חצי שעה, 40 דקות כל פעם, אז זה טוב, במצב רגיל הייתי אומר לכם, זה טוב לפקקים, בדרך למשרד וזה, עכשיו זה טוב בבית, כי גם ככה אין מה לעשות, אתם תקועים בבית, אז תקשיבו לפודקאסט, אבל רק אם אין לכם משהו יותר טוב לעשות. אנחנו חלק מפס, שזה בעצם ארגון עולמי, ארגון ללא כוונות רווח, שמאגד בתוכו את כל משתמשי המייקרוסופט דאטה פלטפורם בעולם, אנחנו חלק מזה, וגם שם, אם עדיין לא עשיתם את זה, מומלץ להיכנס לאתר של פס, pas.org, ולהירשם כחברים בארגון הזה, זה לא שקל, ותקבלו הרבה מאוד בנפיטס, הרבה גישה בעצם לכל הארכיון של הרבה מאוד הרצאות והקלטות, מפגשים, אירועים, המון דברים, הכל נמצא באתר של פס, אז בהחלט מומלץ. גולת הכותרת של פס זה פס סאמיט, אירוע ענק, באמת ענק, הכי גדול בעולם אני חושב, בתחום הזה של דאטה פלטפורם של מייקרוסופט, שקורה פעם בשנה, בדרך כלל הוא כמובן פיזי בארצות הברית, השנה הוא וירטואלי כמו כל דבר אחר, פעם ראשונה שזה וירטואלי בעצם, שזה גם חידוש משמעותי. אז חוץ מזה שהולך להיות מעניין, כי הפורמט הוא שונה ואחר, ואני יודע שפס משקיעים באמת הרבה מאוד להפוך את זה למשהו שהוא יותר, שהוא חווייתי, שהוא יותר מסתם אירוע וירטואלי, אוסף של הרצאות. אז יש פה בעצם איזושהי הזדמנות, אני אומר את זה כל פעם, אבל אני מדגיש, אני חושב שזה חשוב, יש פה הזדמנות לנו הישראלים, או בכלל לאנשים שהם רחוקים מארצות הברית, באמת להגיע לאירוע הזה שבדרך כלל אנחנו לא יכולים לעשות לעצמנו, כי גם הכרטיס מאוד יקר, וגם טיסות ומלון וכולי, הפעם הכרטיס הרבה יותר זול, ואין טיסות ואין מלון ואין כלום, לטוב ולרע, אבל זה חוסך הרבה מאוד כסף, וזה מאפשר להרבה אנשים בעצם כן להצטרף להיות חלק מהאירוע הזה, שהוא אירוע ענק. המון מסלולים במקביל, המון המרצים הכי טובים בעולם בעצם, המון הזדמנויות לנטוורקינג עם הקבוצות מוצר במייקרוסופט, ועם MVPs ועם אנשים מכל העולם, מומלץ, ויש פה, אתם רואים, צד שמאל למטה, יש קוד הנחה, אם אתם נרשמים, תשתמשו בקוד הזה, תקבלו $50 הנחה, זה קוד של הקבוצה שלנו, אז תרשמו לכם אותו, באמת מומלץ, אני חושב שיש פה הזדמנות, לא כל שנה יש לנו את ההזדמנות להצטרף לאירוע הענק הזה, ולחסוך כל כך הרבה כסף, יחסית. ספציפית השנה כבר יש כמה הכרזות, זה יקרה בתחילת נובמבר, דרך אגב, וכבר יצאה הכרזה שרואן קומר, אחד מה-VPs במייקרוסופט, יעביר את הקינוט בעצם ביום הראשון בפס סאמיט, ומבטיחים לנו כבר שיהיו גם כמה הכרזות באירוע הזה, באותו קינוט של מייקרוסופט, אז גם מה שיש למה לצפות, שווה להצטרף אליו. פס מבטיחים אי-בוק של בוב ווארד, שעדיין לא יצא דרך אגב, הוא עדיין בכתיבה, SQL Server 2000, סליחה, ל-Azure SQL Database, הוא יצא איפשהו בדצמבר אמור לצאת הספר הזה, ובעצם ה-1,500 האנשים הראשונים שירשמו, או שנרשמו כבר, אני לא יודע אם כבר עברו את המספר הזה, לפס סאמיט, יקבלו עותק של הספר הזה בחינם. דיברתי קודם על זה שהכל בחינם, אז זה משהו חדש שהתחילו אותו ממש לפני חודש, חודשיים, פס הוציאו את הפרו ממברשיפ, זה עדיין משהו שהוא ככה ניסיוני, אני לפחות עוד לא מודע לכל הפרטים שם, עוד לא נכנסתי לעומק של זה, תיכנסו לאתר, יש פה את הפרטים למטה, את הלינק למטה, תיכנסו ותקראו בעצם מה זה נותן, אני לא זוכר אפילו כמה זה עולה להגיד לכם כרגע, אבל תשלום יחסית סמלי, אתם מקבלים בעצם הרבה יותר ממה שמקבלים בחברות החינמית, כל מיני הזדמנויות ומבצעים והנחות ודברים שלא מקבלים ברגיל, שווה להסתכל על זה ולראות אם זה שווה. ודבר אחרון בהקשר של פס סאמיט, ספיקר איידול. ספיקר איידול זה משהו שדני שרי מוביל כבר כמה שנים טובות, וזה כמו כוכב נולד כזה, תוכנית ריאליטי. בעצם זאת הזדמנות לאנשים שאין להם ניסיון בהדרכה, ורוצים להתחיל את הצד הראשון, ונורא קשה להתקבל לאירועים, בטח בסדר גודל כזה כשאין לך את הניסיון הזה, ופה בעצם נותנים הזדמנות לאנשים כאלה להיכנס ולהעביר סשן של משהו כמו 10 דקות, ויש הרבה כאלה, ועושים תחרות ביניהם, יש חבר שופטים וכולי, ובוחרים בסוף אחד שהיה הכי טוב, והאחד הזה שזוכה מקבל כרטיס כניסה באופן אוטומטי לפס סאמיט בשנה הבאה, לא רק כרטיס כניסה, אלא גם סלוט בעצם להעביר הרצאה, מובטחת לו, לשנה הבאה. ואני יכול להגיד לכם, בשנים קודמות הייתי תמיד יושב בספיקר איידול, וחלק מההרצאות שהכי אהבתי זה שם. אנשים באמת מגיעים שם עם המון יצירתיות ועושים דברים מדהימים, מומלץ בחום להיות חלק מהדבר הזה, גם להצטרף, להשתתף, אבל גם להיות קהל בדבר הזה, יופי של חוויה. virtual groups יש הרבה מכל מיני סוגים, לפי נושאים בדרך כלל, כמו שאתם רואים פה, DBA Fundamentals, Professional Development וכולי. יש פה רשימה, אני לא אעבור עליה, של כל ה-virtual groups הקרובים, שהולכים להיות מתי כל אחד וכולי. מה שמומלץ לעשות זה להיכנס לאתר של פס, אחרי שכבר נרשמתם עם חברים, לדף של ה-virtual groups, ופשוט לעשות סאבסקרייב לנושאים שמעניינים אתכם, וכל פעם שייצא וובינר חדש, תקבלו על זה בעצם הודעה במייל, תירשמו, וחוץ מזה אפשר להיכנס למיטינג ארכייב בכל אחד מה-virtual groups האלה, ויש לכם גם שם הקלטות ואת כל ההיסטוריה של כל ההרצאות שאי פעם היו שם, המון חומר, טריינינג, בחינם לגמרי. אז יש פה את כל החבר'ה האלה, אני לא אעבור עכשיו על כולם כמובן. עוד דבר שפס עושים זה SQL Saturdays, בעולם רגיל, לפני שהמציאו את הקורונה, אז הדברים האלה קורים כמובן באופן פיזי, בכל מיני מקומות בעולם. הרעיון הוא שמתנדבים מקומיים, מארגנים את זה, בעצם גם אנחנו בישראל פעם בשנה מארגנים את SQL Saturday, השנה לצערי זה בוטל בגלל הקורונה, ומה שקורה עכשיו זה שבהרבה מאוד מדינות ממשיכים לארגן את האירועים האלה, אבל הופכים אותם וירטואליים, כמו שאתם רואים פה זה הכל וירטואל. וגם פה בעצם יש פתאום איזושהי הזדמנות, כי תכלס לא הייתם נוסעים כנראה לא יודע מה, לסאו פאולו, רק בשביל להיות ב-SQL Saturday, אבל עכשיו זה אונליין, לא צריך לנסוע עד לשם, אז אפשר להירשם כאטנדי באירוע, כל האירועים האלה בחינמים, הכל בחינם, ובעצם להצטרף לאירועים בכל העולם, כל פעם זה בדרך כלל יום שלם, כמה מסלולים מקבילים, כל מיני הרצאות ומרצים מכל העולם, יש פה, שימו לב כמה, יש פה כל כך הרבה הזדמנויות, אפשר להיכנס לכל אחד מהאתרים האלה ולראות מה האג'נדה ולבחור דברים שמעניינים אתכם, ופשוט להצטרף מרחוק אונליין, מהבית, זה מדהים, מגוון האפשרויות שנפתחו בפנינו בעקבות הדבר הזה. אז שווה להסתכל גם על הסיפור הזה. כרגיל, אנחנו קהילה, אנחנו מנסים לעזור אחד לשני, בטח בתקופה הזאת, אנשים שמחפשים עבודה, אנשים שמחפשים עובדים, יש פה הזדמנות לעשות מאץ', לא נפתח כרגע מיקרופונים, גם ככה אתם אף פעם לא מדברים, אבל אני כן חוזר ואומר, אם יש פה כאלה שמחפשים עבודה, צריכים עזרה במציאת עבודה, או שתדברו איתנו בפייסבוק, בקבוצה, תכתבו שם, תציגו את עצמכם, זה בדיוק המקום, יש שם קרוב ל2,000 חברים, אני זוכר נכון, המון אנשים שיכולים לעזור אחד לשני, או דברו איתי, תפנו לי באופן אישי, אני מכיר הרבה ואני אשמח לעזור ולחבר. קצת על אירועים, טיפה ובזה אני אסיים, אז קודם כל לפני שבועיים, כמו שאמרתי, היה לנו מיטאפ עם ריי מאור, מי שהיה פה, מי שזוכר, מיטאפ מאוד מעניין, על מולטי קולום אינדקסס, ואפשר להיכנס פה ללינק ולראות את ההקלטה של המיטאפ שהיה, וגם להוריד את החומרים, את המצגת של ריי, אז זה מומלץ. מה מחכה לנו בהמשך? אז ב-29, בעוד שבוע, מיד אחרי יום כיפור, יום שלישי, יש לנו שני דברים באותו יום, אני אשם בשניהם, הראשון זה בעצם המפגש הבא של המיטאפ שלנו, והפעם אני הולך להעביר אותו על Extend Events, איך לדבר על Extend Events, מה זה, איך זה נראה, והרבה מאוד דוגמאות, הרבה דוגמאות פרקטיות, איך עושים מוניטורינג וטראבלשוטינג לכל מיני דברים באמצעות Extend Events, אז זה אני אעביר ב-29, בשעה 1:30 בצהריים. באותו יום בערב, כי משעמם לי, בשעה 8 בערב, אני הולך להעביר את ההרצאה הזאת, Modernizing a Data Platform, במסגרת ה-Cloud Virtual Group של פס, שהזכרתי קודם, אז זה יקרה ב8 בערב, הכל בחינם, להכל אפשר להיכנס, להירשם, להצטרף, הכל גם מוקלט, הכל יהיה אפשר לראות אחר כך, אז לא לדאוג. אז כל זה ב-29, ב-17 באוקטובר, קצת אחרי, חודש הבא, זה כבר יוצא נדמה לי אחרי החגים, ממש אחרי החגים, ביום שבת זה יוצא, דאטה וויקנדר. דאטה וויקנדר זה גם עוד אירוע וירטואלי, יש המון אירועים שצצו בזמן האחרון, מאז תקופת הקורונה הזאת, אז זה אחד חדש שצץ, והוא היה פעם אחת בינתיים, והיה מאוד מוצלח, ועכשיו הם עושים את הסיבוב השני. זה יקרה ב-17 לאוקטובר, יום שלם, כרגיל, אתם מכירים את הפורמט, כמה מסלולים במקביל, הרבה הרצאות, הרבה מרצים, לפי נושאים, בחינם, אפשר להירשם, ללכת למה שרוצים, הכל מוקלט, אותו פורמט, יש פה את הלינק, תירשמו. דרך אגב, כרגע ה-Call for Speakers עדיין פתוח, אז אם מישהו שוקל, רוצה להגיש זה הזמן, תעשו את זה, וזה יקרה ב-17 לאוקטובר. ויש עוד הרבה, אבל אחד מפגשים מספיק לעכשיו, אני שמח להזמין ולהציג את Gianluca Sartori. I will switch to English now. So Gianluca is going to talk about monitoring SQL Server without breaking the bank. All kinds of free tools and stuff that you can do yourself. Gianluca is a very famous data platform MVP, also known as Spaghetti DBA. He has some recipes for you, Italian recipes. And I will let Gianluca present himself. And Gianluca, I think it's time for you to share your screen. And let's move on to your session. If you have any questions during Gianluca's session, feel free to write them in the chat, and I will monitor the chat, and I will interrupt Gianluca once in a while and ask you questions.
Good. So I guess we're good to go.
Yeah, Yariv, do you have a question already? I see Yariv is raising his hand.
לא, זה באמת לא שאלה, רק רציתי להגיד שלדעתי זה המקום, למי שעוד, בטח חלק כבר יודעים, חלק לא, אבל למי שעוקב אחרי איגנייט 2020, שבדיוק עכשיו קורה ביומיים האלה, אחת ההכרזות החשובות שם זה כל הנושא של ה-SQL on Edge, מי שזה מעניין ולא שמע את זה עוד.
נכון,
אז
נכון.
טוב לדעת.
תודה. All right. Gianluca, all yours.
Great. So welcome everybody to this session. Today we are going to be discussing monitoring SQL Server without breaking the bank. So a few words about me. Thank you, Guy, for introducing me. My name is Gianluca Sartori. I'm an independent SQL Server consultant, and I've been doing this for a very long time. It's almost 20 years. So this also means that I'm old. I'm a data platform MVP, and currently I'm working as a DBA at a famous Formula One team in Italy. If you want to read my blog, I don't blog often, but there's some content up there. You can find it at spaghettidba.com, and my handle on Twitter is @spaghettidba. So what's the agenda for today? First of all, we're going to go through what we need and what are the needs that we want to cover with a monitoring solution. And then we're going to go and see what the market has to offer in this regard. There are many interesting third-party applications and tools that can help you with monitoring. And then we will switch to seeing what's already inside SQL Server. And then we will have a look at what's available on the community, so open source tools for working with monitoring. Then we will focus on one of those in particular, which is the tech stack, which will be the core of this presentation. Then after introducing the stack, we will go briefly through how you implement it. So first a description, then I will show you how easy it is to use it. Great, so let's have a look at what we need. So many of you probably are DBAs, so you know that the reason why you monitor your instances is because you want to be able to answer questions. And depending on what are your needs, the questions could be along these lines. So the phone rings and somebody asks you, hey, what was happening on the server tonight? Because I had an ETL job that was running and it started to get slower and slower, then it halted completely. What was happening on the server? So if you turn to your server right now and you run your diagnostic queries, you probably can tell what is happening right now, but you cannot tell what was happening in the past unless you have something that records your performance and whatever was happening at a different point in time, so some time in the past. So other questions could have to do with tuning your queries. So a developer could ask you, listen, my application is not very quick. I want to tune my queries and I would like to know which ones are the ones that consume more resources. And in order to answer that, you need to have some monitoring in place that records all the queries and can rank them by CPU usage or disk usage and so on. Other questions could have to do with capacity planning. So you may want to know how fast your disk bases are growing. And we're not only talking about disk usage, but it's also a resource consumption in general. So imagine that you have this server that is perfectly suitable for what it's doing right now. But project the present moment in 2 years. Will the CPU be enough for running the workload? Will the disks be big enough to store all the data? Will the I/O subsystem be good enough to serve all the data the workload is requiring? The only way to know this is to record usage of all the resources over time and project it in the future in order to be prepared to react to the growth of the workload in advance instead of reacting when it's too late. Another thing that usually happens is that users call you on the phone and say, hey, today nothing is working because today everything is slow. Well, you probably know that slow and fast, it's all about perception. So how can you tell if things are really bad today? You would have to compare today with a normal day when things are okay and no major incident has happened. That is what we call a baseline. So a normal day that we can compare to the present moment in order to know whether things are normal or not. And the only way to do this is to have something that records that baseline. And another activity that we do with monitoring is also receiving alerts when things go wrong. So if you start receiving deadlocks or blocking or long-running queries, you probably want to be notified about it. And the way to do this is having a monitoring solution in place. So what's the easiest way to implement all this? The easiest way is to go on the market and buy something. We have some fantastic products in order to fulfill all these needs. And we have players like Sentry or Quest, Redgate, Idera, SolarWinds. They all have fantastic products. They were built specifically for SQL Server. So these are not general purpose monitoring solution. These contain all the logic specific to SQL Server. They know exactly what to query. They know exactly how to visualize the information they collect. They know exactly how to pull the data from SQL Server and how to alert when things go wrong. There's only one downside to using a commercial product for this, and it's money. just to give you a rough idea, the top players in this area will charge you something around 2,000 euros or $2,000 per instance to buy one of their monitoring solutions. And this could definitely work for 10 instances, maybe 20. When you start to have hundreds or thousands of instances, surely this isn't a viable solution. So you totally need to find an alternative. And that could be looking at the tools that you already have inside SQL Server. You probably know that you have a lot of means to analyze, record, and treat all the diagnostic information that comes from SQL Server. You have all the bricks to build a monitoring solution by yourself. It definitely is complicated. You will never get the quality that the commercial products have, but you may want to monitor some of the aspects, the ones that are more critical for you, using the tools that you already have in SQL Server. So for capturing events, you have SQL Trace and extended events. You also have alerts built into SQL Server Agent. You could also use some of the tools that you have in Management Studio, like the Activity Monitor. This is not perfect, but it works for having a quick glance of performance. And you also have reports built into Management Studio. You have a lot of reports, and some of those are really useful for taking performance under control. There is also a feature called the data collector that was developed by Microsoft at some point to fight the feature war with other commercial database products like Oracle that had a very good, actually, monitoring solution built into the product. So at some point, Microsoft decided to respond to that by creating the data collector. The data collector is basically a collection of integration services packages included in all editions of SQL Server and all versions from 2008 and above. And some diagnostic and monitoring data is extracted by those integration services packages and uploaded to a centralized database, which is called the Performance Data Warehouse. And that database contains all the information from the monitored servers. And then you have some reports built into Management Studio that you can use to visualize the data. So the data is recorded over time. These integration services packages run at regular intervals, and you can go back in time and see what was happening on your server at a given point in the past. So this is actually good for troubleshooting. You can go back to a moment in the past and you can tell what the weights looked like, what CPU looked like. You can also see the queries that were running at that point. And if users are asking what was happening at that time, you probably can answer that question. There are some downsides to using the data collector. First of all, it's unreliable. It's damn unreliable. It works by using some SQL agent jobs that run the integration services packages. And those from time to time may look like they're running, but they're not collecting anything. And you have to go and look at some very obscure logs to understand what is happening. And when you're saving all the data to a single database and you start to look at the data with built-in reports, things start to get a bit slow. Also, there's no alerting. all the data that is collected does not have any alerting. So for blocking, deadlocking, and other interesting events, you don't have anything that alerts you when interesting events happen. It is really hard to customize and extend. So if you want to add some queries to the collection agents, it's really complicated to do. And also keep in mind that now it is officially deprecated. So Microsoft is putting this feature in the deprecation list, and they won't be shipping any new features to this functionality. So what else can we do? We certainly don't want to bet on a deprecated feature to monitor SQL Server. So we probably need to find an alternative. And turns out that the community has many. We have mainly two areas here, two kind of tools from the community. So we have some tools that are SQL Server specific monitoring tools, and others that are generic monitoring solutions that have some ways of monitoring also SQL Server. So let's have a look at the ones for SQL Server first. Here, probably the most interesting solutions that we have now is called SQL Watch. It's a relatively young project, and you can find it on GitHub. This has been created by Marcin Gimski, or I hope I pronounced his name correctly. And he's a Polish guy who lives in England, and he created SQL Watch. And all the data it collects is grabbed by agent jobs that upload the data to a dedicated SQL Watch database, and then you can use Power BI desktop or Grafana to visualize the data that is recorded by SQL Watch. So this is a very promising project, and it's constantly improving, so I suggest that you keep an eye on it. Other SQL Server specific tools. Yes, is there a question, Guy?
Yeah, there's a question from the audience. You mentioned the built-in tools earlier, but you didn't mention Query Store. What about Query Store?
Yes, a Query Store is, I wouldn't call it a monitoring tool. It is good for getting an idea of characterizing the workload. So understanding which queries are consumer resources. It is good for recording plans over time and see the behavior of specific queries over time. But I would not consider it as a complete monitoring solution. This is certainly something you can pull some information from, but not definitely a monitoring tool per se.
Okay, thanks.
So other tools here that you can use for SQL Server, there's dbatools. dbatools is a PowerShell module. It contains hundreds of functions that can help you in your day-to-day work with SQL Server. I heard it defined as SSMS in PowerShell, which is a definition that I like. You can do whatever you do with SSMS with dbatools and much more. So this is a fantastic automation tool for DBAs. And if you never played with dbatools, go and do it now. And dbatools can do many things for you, including running queries at a schedule and upload the data to a centralized database for monitoring. So you can monitor some aspects of your SQL Server using dbatools, and you can automate many collections using it. And other tools that I included here, those are two small projects of mine. One is called Extended T-SQL Collector, and this is a way to extend what the data collector does out of the box. You can make it work with extended events as well, but I wouldn't recommend you to use the data collector now that it is deprecated. If you already are using it and you also want to play with extended events, you can go and have a look at this project. Otherwise, another tool that I can suggest you is called XC Smart Target, and both can be found on GitHub. And this one can help you work with extended events. So automate some responses to extended events without having to write a single line of code. And if you want to use some of the generic monitoring solutions, there are many that you can use. Here you find tools like Nagios or Zabbix or Cacti. Many of these tools have some plugins for SQL Server, so they are able to monitor SQL Server as well as Oracle or many other platforms. There's also a trend that is very interesting in the last few years of analytic platforms that are used to monitor SQL Server. Examples here, you can have Elasticsearch as the backend to store the data, and then Kibana for the dashboards. And then you have Prometheus plus Grafana, and also you have the tick stack, which is the one that we will describe in this session. So let's have a closer look to the tick stack. The tick stack is a stack of 4 tools built by InfluxDB. InfluxDB is a company, a software company that built these tools, and the initials form the word tick. So Telegraf, InfluxDB, Chronograph, and Capacitor. These are open source tools, so this means that you can find the source code on GitHub. All of these are written in Go. And you can go and use these tools freely to monitor your SQL Server infrastructure. So let's describe all these tools together. We have the core of the solution is InfluxDB. This is a database. It's a time series database. So this means that it's designed and optimized to store data that contains a date, a time dimension. So it is suitable for storing every information that also contains a time column. And it is a NoSQL database. This means it's not a relational database. The data is not organized in rows and columns, and also cannot be queried using SQL. You need to use something else. And that something else could be one of the 2 available languages. The first one is called InfluxQL, which is a bit similar to SQL. You have some of the language constructs that are also found in InfluxQL, like select, from, group by. So you will find some of those in InfluxQL as well. But there are also some proprietary additions to the language. There's also another language which is called Flux, which is the one that InfluxDB suggests to use from now on, which is completely different from SQL, I'm sorry. And this one looks more like JavaScript, so you have curly braces and arrows. It looks a bit like LINQ, but it definitely doesn't look like SQL. And another part of the stack is called Telegraf. This one is the collection agent, so the process that takes care of reading the data from the object it is monitoring. So it has plugins to work with many sources. It could monitor databases like or Elasticsearch or Graylog, also SQL Server, why not? And it can monitor many other things like Docker or web servers like Apache. So it has a ton of plugins and it can monitor almost anything. And also has output for many formats, including obviously InfluxDB, which is the native way of storing the data collected by Telegraf. Another part of the stack is called chronograph. This is a bit like SSMS for SQL Server, so it plays two roles. A query interface for reading the data inside the database, and also an administration interface for the tick stack. So it could administer InfluxDB and Capacitor, and it also has the ability to explore the data inside InfluxDB. As we said, the data needs to have a time dimension, and usually what you want to capture is numeric data. So the easiest way to visualize this is through charts. And you can save these charts to dashboards, and you can save these dashboards inside chronographs. So you can go back at a later time and have a look at the data inside these dashboards. Another part of the stack is called Capacitor. This is a data processing engine, and it works for transforming the data or send alerts in response to some data showing up in the collection. So when we set up Capacitor, it listens to the data being written to InfluxDB using some topics. And you can subscribe to these topics with some handlers, and these handlers are basically some scripts that can do some actions in response to the data showing up on the topics. So you can send alerts or transform the data that arrives to the topics, and the alerts can be sent using many channels. Using different plugins. So you have one plugin for email, for Slack, for Telegram, for Teams, really plugins for everything you can think of for notifying events.
And look, there is a comment from Ranjit. He said that currently Telegraf doesn't capture currently running queries into InfluxDB.
From SQL Server, well, it does. It does. It uses a variation of a combination of systemexec requests and sessions, and there's a query to capture running queries. Obviously, what you see depends on how often you run the monitoring query. So yeah, you need to tune that as well. Okay, so another tool that really doesn't, is not a part of the tick stack is called Grafana. And sometimes people call this the TIG stack when you use Grafana for visualizing the data instead of chronograph. And what is Grafana? Is monitoring analytics platform that is really suitable for creating dashboards very easily, and has the ability to read data from InfluxDB natively. So this is really a good choice for working with data stored in InfluxDB by Telegraf. And creating dashboards with Grafana is really easy, and it's a very powerful tool, which also has some built-in community dashboards available. So if you don't want to write your own dashboards, design your own dashboards, you can use some of the dashboards available from the community. And if you look at the plugins available for Telegraf, you will probably find a corresponding dashboard for Grafana that is able to read the data and visualize the data for a specific Telegraf plugin, including the one for SQL Server. So looking at the overall architecture, it is something like this. You have your database, there's Telegraf that connects to the database and runs some queries to collect the data. And then it uploads the data to InfluxDB, where you can have your capacitor listening to the data that shows up and processes this data in order to run some alerts. On top of that, you can use Chronograph to query and explore the data, and you can set up your dashboards using Grafana. Cool. So how do you implement all of this? Don't worry, because it's incredibly easy to do. So let's have a look at how you do it. First of all, you're going to have to go and install InfluxDB. And this is incredibly easy again. All you have to do is go and download InfluxDB. You need to unzip the archive, and then there's a single executable you need to run. You probably want to open the firewall port in order to let Telegraf write to InfluxDB, and probably you also want to run it as a service. So let's go ahead and do it. What I have here is a clean environment. This is a vanilla Windows server. So what I'm gonna do is go to demo, and I'm gonna use some PowerShell script to set up all of this. What happens? Okay. So first of all, I'm going to run a setup which is going to delete any previous demo data. And then I'm going to go and use InfluxDB. I hope this is big enough. Otherwise, just tell me and I'm going to make it bigger. So first of all, as we said, we need to go and download InfluxDB. I'm going to use this version, which is the 179. So what I will do is download that. Well, actually, I'm going to cheat. I'm not going to download it because I downloaded this previously. But I will expand this archive to C-tick. So I'm going to go here and see what I have in C-tick, and I have my InfluxDB folder. Inside, I find my influxd.exe, and this is the one that is the daemon that runs InfluxDB. So if I want to run it, all I have to do is maybe change some of the configuration, but this is not something I will do in this demo. And I will accept all the defaults and run it. So if I run this, this is InfluxD running in the background. As you saw here, we had this splash appearing, and then it says, okay, I'm listening. So this is InfluxDB running on this system. This is pretty cool, but if I close the window, InfluxDB goes away, which is probably not what I want. So I will need to install it as a service. And you probably know that not all executables can be run as a service. In order to run an executable as a service, it needs to have 3 handles to execute the start, pause, and stop commands by the Windows service infrastructure. And InfluxD does not have these handles. So we will need to use a wrapper for that. And that wrapper is called an SSM. An SSM is the non-sucking service manager. Why this name? In the past, Microsoft has created a tool for this, which was called SAV-ANY, and it had the ability to run another executable as a service, but it sucked. Just to give you an idea, you could start any application using SAV-ANY. So you could start the service started SAV-ANY, which in turn ran your application. If the application crashed 1 second after starting, the service appeared to be running happily because SAV-ANY was running, which obviously sucked. So we had somebody that took the time to code a decent service manager for Windows, and he called it the non-sucking service manager. So we will go and download this one, and we will use it to run InfluxDB as a service. So let's go back to the demos. We will download this one as well. We will expand it to CTIC. So let's go back here. We will go to NSSM and Windows 64, and we have a single executable here. All we have to do is run that executable with some arguments. In this case, I will run an SSM install InfluxDB, which is the name of the service I want to run. So let's do that. And this GUI appears. All I have to do is pick the path to the executable, so influxd.exe. And if I have some arguments, I can put them here, and all I have to do is click install service, and boom, I have a service in my Windows that I can start. Let's go to services. Let's find InfluxDB, and there you go. Here it is. I could click here and run it. I could also start it using an SSM itself, but I will use services for running it. Okay, so now InfluxDB is running on my server. Great, so what else can I do? Now I only have an empty database server with InfluxDB. All I have to do now is start collecting some data with Telegraf. So now I will go and download it, I will unzip it, and then I have to configure what it needs to do. So basically, I have to configure what it will collect, so the input, and where it will write the data, so the output. Let's go ahead and do it. It's super easy. So let's go to Telegraf here, and I have to download my Telegraf. And again, I cheated because I downloaded this previously, but I will expand it to CTIC. So let's go back here and have a look. Telegraf. So Telegraf, again, is a single executable, but it has some configuration that I need to check before I run it. So first of all, I will run Telegraf itself with the config argument, and this will print all available configuration options on the standard output. Then I will send this output to a file so I can go and have a look at all the possible configuration options and configure them according to my needs. There's a small glitch here. When you do this, when you pipe the configuration options from the standard output to a text file, what you get is a UTF-16 file, which is not understood by Telegraf itself. So I would have to go here and convert it to UTF-8, which is understood by Telegraf. So let's do this, and now I can show you what the configuration file looks like. Let's have a look. And wow, this is a huge file. Let's go to the end. It's almost 6,000 lines of configuration options, and there's no way I'm gonna touch this. Too complicated. So let's close that. Let's do something that makes more sense. I am going to run again Telegraf config, but this time I'm going to instruct Telegraf to filter the input to only SQL Server and output to only InfluxDB, which is the ones that I'm interested in. So I'm going to go and do this. I'm going to pipe that to a file, and again it's a UTF-16 file, so I need to convert it, and I can remove the UTF-16 one, and I can show you what it looks like when it is filtered. Okay, so now we're talking. It's 500 lines, which is much more manageable. So first of all, let's have a look at the general configurations. Interval controls how often you pull the data. So 10 seconds or 15 seconds is more than reasonable, I would say. Here you can control the size of the batches and the buffer size, which is used by Telegraf to upload the data. The flush interval controls how often you write to the output, so to the InfluxDB. Oh no, there's no way I'm going to update code during the session. And what else can you control? Well, you can change where the log file is. And what else? Oh, now we need to configure the output. So how we write to InfluxDB. So we have an InfluxDB server running on this machine. So all we have to do is tell it to use it. So URLs is a list of the output InfluxDB servers, and I will use this one. So localhost on 8086, which is the default port for InfluxDB. I need to give a name to the database. It is going to be called Telegraf, and I will use, well, skip database creation. If the database already exists, you can set this to true, but I need to create the database up front, so let's leave it to false. And what else? Username and password. It will create a username and password that matches the ones that I fill in here. So I'm going to use Telegraf for that. And what else? Well, I guess we're good to go like this. Okay, so we can go and save it. And now we need to configure the input. So these are also processor plugins. We're not going to touch that. We're not going to touch even the, what else? The aggregator plugins. We're going to leave that as it is. Oh, input. Good. So we have input SQL Server. Here, all we have to do is configure which servers we want to monitor. So I have a SQL Server here, and it's on localhost port 1433. I don't need username and password because I will use Windows authentication for this. And app name Telegraf, sounds good. And okay, here I can control which queries I will use. There's a set of queries for version 1 and version 2, and it's also going to change soon. And this means that I don't need to specify the text for the queries. This is already included in Telegraf. Telegraf already knows what to query. Inside the executable, it already has all the queries it needs to run to SQL Server in order to monitor it. So all I have to do is select the version of the queries, and in case I want to exclude some of the queries, I can put the excluded queries here in this list. So this is incredibly easy to do. So let's go back to the configuration here. Now that I have my configuration file ready, I can test whether this works or not. So I'm going to run telegraf-config path to the configuration file -test. And this means use that configuration file and print the data on the standard output. So I'm going to go and run it. And as you can see, it created some output. So this means it is working. This output is in a line protocol. This is a protocol used by InfluxDB and Telegraf to post the data to InfluxDB. So it is working. Now I can start Telegraf and it will collect the queries every 10 seconds as I configure it. So I can run it, Telegraf --config and the path to the configuration file. And I could also install it as a service. Telegraf has the ability to run as a service by itself, so I don't need to use an SSM to wrap it. It can run as a service natively, and all I have to specify is the name of the service, the display name of the service, and the path to the configuration file. So I can do this. Let's start it. Oh, wow, it failed because I need to run this as an admin, which I didn't do. So trust me, it works, but I need to run this as an admin, which I forgot to do. So I will start it manually. And now Telegraf is collecting data and uploading it to my InfluxDB database. How can I make sure it is collecting the data and writing it to InfluxDB? No problem. All I have to do is connect to my InfluxDB database using the Influx executable. This is not InfluxD, this is Influx. This is the query tool for InfluxDB. So let's go ahead and run this. So when it runs, I can tell it to show me the databases. So show databases. I have the Telegraf databases. It has been created. So use Telegraf. I want to make this bigger, probably. Use Telegraf. And now I can tell it to show me what's inside. So show measurements, never type in demos. And measurements are the equivalent of tables in InfluxDB. And as you can see, I have some SQL Server _ something as measurements in my InfluxDB database. So it is working. It is collecting data. Cool. Let's go ahead and close this. And now we could also use Chronograph to display the data we are collecting. So I need to go ahead and download it. I can then expand the archive to CTIC as I did with all the other tools. And now I can start it as a background service, background process. This is the background process for Telegraf, Chronograph, sorry. I could also run this as a service using an SSM, but I will run this interactively now. And in order to interact with the application, I will have to start a browser window because this is a web application. So let's do this. The default port for Chronograph is 8888. So welcome to Chronograph. Let's get started. All I have to do is create a connection to an InfluxDB database. So it will be Telegraf and Telegraf, and the name of the database is Telegraf. So add the connection. And it works. I have a connection. So now I could create a dashboard, but I want to skip that. And I also want to skip capacitor so I can view all my connections. And I have an InfluxDB connection that I can use to pull some data. I could use the explore function to have a look at the data inside my database. And this is a query that I already had from a previous execution of the demos. And as you can see, this is InfluxQL. It looks a bit like SQL. I have select, from, there's a group by, what else? There's a where, but also you see there are some placeholders and things like fill null, which mean absolutely nothing to me, but no problem because you have, oh, sorry, what did I do? You have a GUI for working with your queries. So you can go here and select whatever. I have SQL Server Performance, so I can expand the counters and go and include block tasks. And also I can go here and say the value will be included here. So as you can see, it changed my InfluxQL query to reflect what I selected in the GUI. So you actually don't need to learn InfluxQL, which is a good idea, but not mandatory. Okay, so what else can I do now that I have my data displaying on Chronograph? I could also use InfluxDB to do some cool stuff. So before we do this, some terminology. As we said, what we call tables in SQL Server is called a measurement in InfluxDB. And what we call columns generically in SQL Server could be a tag or a field in InfluxDB. A tag is an indexed column, and a field is a non-indexed column. So usually tags contain string data that you can use for filtering and grouping, and the field contains numeric data that you can use for aggregations and displaying points. And what we call rows in SQL Server is a point in InfluxDB. Another part of the stack is called Grafana. So again, we can go back here and I will show you that it's super easy to work with Grafana as well. So let's go to Grafana. I will download Grafana. I actually tried to use a later version, but it's safer to use the old one that I already tested. So I can expand Grafana. And it's quite a big archive. It's bigger than the other ones we played with so far. So it takes a while to expand. And what's wrong with that? Oh, well, never mind. It probably works anyway because I have a previous execution. Yes, it does. So let's go back. And again, for Grafana, I need to change the configurations. And the way to do this is to copy the default configuration to my own configuration, and then I can use it to change whatever I want to change. So, for example, I will change the listen port from 3000, which is the default, to 8080. So it makes something that I can use more easily. But there, as you can see, there are many things you can change. This is a huge configuration file. I don't know the meaning of all these configuration options, but for sure you can use the documentation to see what they all mean. So again, I will start Grafana. This is a background process. I will use the configuration file for that, and also home path to tell it where to find all the other pieces of Grafana. And now it is running. I will probably want to use an SSM to start it as a service again, but I'm okay with running interactively for these demos. Again, I will use a browser to connect to it because it is a web application, and it looks like this. So admin, the first time you log in, admin is a default credentials. And in fact, it tells me, hey, you need to change that. So I'm changing it back to admin again because security first. And let's save that. And now welcome to Grafana. So what can I do? I need to install a data source, and it's going to be an InfluxDB data source. So let's do that. I can use localhost 8086. And what's the name of the database? Telegraf. And username is Telegraf, and password is again Telegraf. And save and test. Yes, it works. So we have a data source now. Now that we have a data source, I probably want to create a new dashboard. But I'm lazy. I don't want to do that. So I can go here to manage, and instead of creating a new dashboard, I want to import an existing one. And where can I find it? I can go to grafana.com and look for dashboards that contain SQL Server in the name. So let's do that. Grafana.com, these are all the dashboards that contain SQL Server. And I really like this one by, where is it? Jonathan Ryu, where is that? Has it disappeared? Oh, here's the one, SQL Servers. So let's have a look. There's a preview. Well, looks good. Yeah, pretty cool. Exactly what I needed. Great. So all I have to do is copy this URL and paste it here, and boom, I have my dashboard. All I have to do is select a data source, import the dashboard, and now I am monitoring my local SQL Server. And it couldn't be easier than this. It is working. It's showing me the database size, size of the logs, and SQL stats like batch requests per second, full scans and index searches, and what else? Database activity, transactions per second errors, and what else? Connections, transaction wait stats. There's anything you can dream of in this dashboard, and it is ready, available for you to use. And what else? It shows you also the queries running. No, you don't have that in this dashboard, but it is super easy to create your own. And wow, that was super easy. Let's go back to here, and let's go back to the slides first. In Grafana, you can also configure some alerts. So instead of using capacitor, you can use Grafana for alerts. For each dashboard, for each panel, you can create a notification. And you can have different channels for notifying. As you can see, there's email, Slack, and Teams, and anything you can think of. And this is built for alerting on the single dashboards. If you don't want to do this, you can use Chronograph for that. We're not going to be setting up Chronograph because it takes a bit of time and you need to write a script for that. But I will show you what you can do by running continuous queries in InfluxDB. This is something that you can use for running scheduled tasks to move the data from your retention policies to other retention policies by downsampling and aggregating the data. So as you could see here in my dashboard, I had my data collected every 10 seconds. So looking at CPU, for instance, let's find the CPU. Where is that? Where's CPU? I don't see it. CPU, where are you? Well, I can't find it, but it's somewhere here. I don't know this dashboard very well, but your CPU is collected every 10 seconds. And that means that if you collect that for a long time, it's going to be a lot of points. So you don't want to do that for, let's say, 2 years. You don't want to keep that for 2 years. You probably want to keep that for 2 weeks at most. And if you want to know how the CPU looks like in the long run, because you need to do some capacity planning, you probably want to aggregate that and downsample that. So instead of keeping your samples every 10 seconds, you probably want to aggregate that into hours and keep that for 2 years, so you can use it to do your capacity planning. And continuous queries, so you can think of those like agent jobs, can do that for you. So you can build dashboards on top of the tables populated by your continuous queries. So wrapping up, what can we say now? If you think of the questions that we had at the beginning, so the needs we wanted to cover with a monitoring solution, let's see if we're okay using the tick stack for that. So for troubleshooting, for going back in the past and see what was happening on the server, are we covered? I think we are. We have Telegraf for collecting the data. We can use InfluxDB for storing it. And Grafana can have dashboards for displaying that data. And you can use built-in dashboards or community dashboards, or you can create your own. And for tuning performance, you can create your own dashboards to display the data and rank your queries by resource consumption. And for capacity planning, we can use continuous queries to write to more loose, to bigger retention policies and create custom dashboards on top. And the same applies to baselining. We can create the baselines by aggregating the points using continuous queries and build a dashboard on top. For alerting, we could use Capacitor or Grafana, and also XC Smart Target works for that. I will also leave you with some resources if you want to have a look at the stack. InfluxData.com is the place to go to have a look at InfluxDB. The non-sunken service manager can be found at nssm.cc, and Grafana can be found at grafana.com. There's also here a link to a blog post of mine that shows you how to collect some diagnostic data using Glenberry's diagnostic queries on your whole SQL Server estate using dbatools and centralize the storage of that data on a central SQL Server database. And here is a link to XC Smart Target in case you want to use it to pull some data from your extended events and write it also to InfluxDB. And if you have questions, this is a time to ask. And if you are too shy to ask questions, you can always write an email. I'm really slow to respond, but promised I do respond to everyone.
Okay, so we have some questions. First, is there a way to plug in extend events into InfluxDB?
Yes, and the way is called XC Smart Target. So let's go ahead and open this one. I'm going to show you XC Smart Target. And XC Smart Target. So if you go to the documentation, so the wiki, you have the ability to use some response type to process the extended events that you receive. And we have a Telegraf appender response. And what it does, example here, let's zoom in a bit. So what it does, you can attach it to your local SQL Server, attach to a session name which is called errors, and that session records all the errors. You need to configure in a separate T-SQL your session, so it needs to exist. And what you can do is use the Telegraf appender response, filter it to collect the error reported events, and then you can use InfluxDB to upload the data using an InfluxD input, and you can specify the output measurement, so where it needs to be written to InfluxDB, what are the tags that you want to use, and these need to correspond to the fields or actions or of your event. And if you have fields, you can specify them here in the output fields. This will create a line protocol output on the standard output, and Telegraf is capable of capturing that output and upload it to InfluxDB. I will write on my blog on how to do this, but you can go ahead and experiment with this. If you need help with this, just drop me a line and I will get back to you.
Nice. Okay, another question from Nainesh. He said they use a tick stack and they have an issue with named instances that have the hide instance configuration enabled. And in those cases, Telegraf is not able to connect to the SQL instances. Are you familiar with that?
So in which case?
There is a feature in a configuration manager. When you use a named instance, you can enable a hide instance. So
hide instance. Yeah. Oh, okay, I see. So in that case, all you have to do, instead of connecting to the name of the instance, you probably want to connect to the specific port of the instance. It's probably not going to be the 1433, the default port, but you can specify the port on the Telegraf configuration file.
All right, thanks. Oh, what about Ferrari this year?
Next question, please.
Yeah. Okay, so regarding the hide instance, it says they tried using port already, but it didn't work, unfortunately. I really don't know. And also the alias, they tried to use the alias, server alias.
Okay, so these SQL Server aliases only work for .NET connections. They're not going to work with Go connections. There's a driver for SQL Server in Go, and that doesn't regard SQL Server aliases on the client. I think so if you specify hostname plus port instead of hostname / name of the instance plus port, it should probably work.
Yeah, it should.
It should, but I have no idea. I'm guessing. Yeah. But write me an email and I will get back to you. I will try to make it work. I'm not sure I will be able to, but no promises, but I'll do my best to make it work.
Cool, thanks. Any other questions? Anyone? Well, looks like that's it.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me then.
Well, thank you, Gianluca. It was a great session. It's really interesting. I mean, there's a lot of things to learn here, to get to use, but it looks like a really huge potential for monitoring for free. So
yep, yeah, I really like it. Also, there's one last thing that I want to tell you, that all the examples that I had today can be found in my GitHub. There's a code samples repository, so I'm going to go ahead and paste the link in the chat for this meeting. So you probably want to grab that now before the meeting ends. And the one is monitoring without breaking the bank. So you have all the demos and the PowerPoints for this meeting.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Gianluca.
Thank you.
The recording is going to be uploaded to the meetup page. I will also put there the link to the session materials, so you can check it there later. And see you in the next meetup next Tuesday. Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Bye-bye.
גיא, אתה שם?